Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. One of the things that I want to take a look at today is not necessarily the storyline, but rather how the characterization gave an idea of what the narrator was feeling. One of the things I want to point out in this video is that the narrator is not necessarily somebody that's very proactive. While he is a main character of the story, he's not necessarily someone that does a lot of action in regards to how things are playing out. Generally speaking, as the main character, he is not somebody that is supposed to be receptive, but rather proactive in how he handles everything that's going on around him. What ends up going on is that we see the world through the narrator's eyes. We see through, Nick is the name of the character, but we see through Nick's eyes of how this situation's unfolding. Rather being an active participant in it, he is just simply a view screen that we see the events as they take place. One of the things that I wanted to take a look at in this video is not necessarily how the story is structured or how he goes about his business, but rather how we are able to take a look at how F. Scott Fitzgerald created these characters to create an image in our mind. Well, there are ways that we can do this in our own writing, and I want to get into that today. A little bit of background about the story is that it is set in the pre-Depression era. This is the Roaring 20s. This is the period of time where prohibition was a thing. It wasn't until much later that prohibition was actually repealed. So when they talk about drinking in this story, you have to keep in mind that they're talking about illegal drinking. They're talking about the time when things weren't allowed to be drunk as far as alcohol. Generally speaking, the idea of prohibition was pretty much not well received after the fact, which is why it was one of the only amendments that was overturned. Not to say that there weren't reasons why they did it, but in the end it caused more problems. Actually, the basis of Gatsby is the fact that he's a bootlegger. He's somebody that provides alcohol to people. This is where the mob really took off, is that they were able to take advantage of the situation. According to my research, it started taking place in 1922, about 2 years after her prohibition had begun. So this is still early on, but we see in the story that alcohol is still really prevalent, to the point where you have things like speakeasies, and alcohol is something that's carried around all the time. The enforcement of the prohibition was not something that was actually universally accepted, and there were issues in regards to that when it comes to policy with the government. So much so that there were instances where the government actually poisoned alcohol and allowed it to go out to the world, causing a lot of people to get sick and die. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the idea of alcohol was not something that was universally hated, but there was enough people that believed that we should get rid of it that passed the prohibition. As I said, prohibition was repealed a lot later on in our history, but it was still something that was seen as quite common. It just made it a lot more restrictive, but that didn't mean that the issues that they were trying to prevent went away. That's one of the downsides of trying to find a single solution to a people's woes, is that in the end, that's not going to solve our problems. Our problems are always going to be multifaceted. For instance, a lot of people can see the drunkenness of prior prohibition era and think that alcohol was the issue. Alcohol was not the issue. The issue was other socioeconomic factors that were playing a part in it. So this is all something that we need to keep in mind when we're telling the stories, is that how are we creating an element of what our characters are projecting onto the page so that we can give a semblance of how they are actually being received by our reader. And if we take a look at Nick as our narrator as a view screen, how is he seeing what's going on, and how does his intuition or how does his interiority actually play into how we are perceiving it? A lot of what we do as far as interpreting of the page comes down to how the main character's interpreting it. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that Nick, our main viewpoint, isn't somebody that's going throughout. They actually switch up. So we are seeing through all of the events that are taking place, but we need to make sure that we're keeping in mind of how we are doing this. All right, so let's get to chapter 1. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. Here we are given a description of our main antagonist, Tom. He's somebody that is a very powerful individual, but he's also somebody that is cruel, as by this last phrase, a cruel body, somebody that is inherently cruel based on how powerful of a man he is. We are assigning a morality to him based on his looks. Civilization's going to pieces, Tom broke out violently. Catch that, violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about these things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Why no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is that if we don't look out for the white race, we will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Here's this false equivalence of what's going on with his intelligence. He is trying to portray something. He's trying to portray that he's smart, that he is reading, that he's well read. We know early on in the story that Tom comes from a well-to-do house, well-to-do family where he makes a lot of money, which is why he's able to afford a lot of the things that are going on. But this use of it's all scientific stuff, it's all been proved. This idea that we can prove how things are going to play out based on one person's perspective is something that even today we fall foul of. We need to make sure that in our writing, we can point stuff like this out and say, hey, people believe these things for these reasons, and while it might make sense to them, it's ultimately false because it's not based on reality. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. Here we go, again, the most advanced people. Here is this idea that they are appealing. This is Daisy who's talking. She's appealing to these people with authority. She's appealing to these people that have more knowledge about the situation. So the most advanced people. Later on, there's a point where somebody says, she's beautiful, and the people who ought to know tell me this. These are the things that reoccur in the story, that they are relying on other people to validate their own beliefs. They are not standing on the beliefs themselves, but rather how other people are saying they should feel. This gives us an indication that they aren't people who are actually believing what they're saying. These are things that they are trying to make themselves seem bigger than they are, or more intelligent than they are. This happens again and again. This is the thing I wanted to get at, is that we have characters in these stories that are creating these fake ideas of what's going on. And so by doing this, they say, hey, look at me, I'm special, I'm not a horrible person. But because they do this and because it's so phony, our main character, Nick, sees through this. And we are seeing through his eyes how he is able to not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly notice that these people are not good people. Here is our first introduction to Gatsby. I decided to call him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I couldn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way. Afar as I was from him, I have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily I glanced seaward, and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away. That might have been the end of the dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Here, this is something that we're giving an early glance of Gatsby by trembling, by showing that he's trembling, where you're showing that he is sincere in his beliefs. He is sincere in what he's trying to do. We learned later that that single green light that's mentioned here is actually the dock across the way, which belongs to Daisy, his love interest. This is the person he's been chasing his entire life, that he can actually love, that he's been holding on to this idea of the past, that if he could just make enough money, that he could go back to the past. Chapter 2. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic, and the retinas are a yard. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. This is an image that pops up again and again and again. The idea here, and it goes into this a little bit later, is that he is watching, that this is a semblance of God. This is a facsimile of God, that he is watching over the events and he is not approving of them. We're getting off, he insisted. I want you to meet my girl. I think he'd tank up a good deal at luncheon, his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The superfluous assumption was on Sunday afternoon that I had nothing better to do. Here again, he's using the term violence. He's using this term of this man is a violent person who does whatever he needs to do physically to get his way. Here we are a little bit later. Next week, I have my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he? No, he doesn't, said Tom coldly. And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all. I didn't mean that, explained Wilson quickly. I just meant basically what's going on here is that you have a character who is using manipulation to push this character Wilson and giving him a reason to why he's there. By doing this, he's creating a semblance of a highly manipulative person. This is what the author is trying to get, that Tom isn't just somebody that's strong, but he's also very manipulative. This is somebody that is not an idiot, but rather somebody who's very quick and is willing to do whatever he can to get what he wants. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes on a row along the railroad track. Terrible place, isn't it? Tom said, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks he goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. These are things that Tom is doing to alleviate himself from the guilt that's going on. We see this here. This place is terrible, isn't it? He is seeing Eckelberg as somebody who's frowning on him, who's saying this is a bad thing. And his response is, oh, he's so dumb, he doesn't know he's alive. He has, because he's more intelligent, has the right to take another man's wife. He has the right to do with her as he will. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Beckham and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. Here, the writer is giving a difference between the two, Tom and Mrs. Wilson. He is not showing that they are close, but rather he's creating a distance by naming both of their last names. First by using Tom's full name and Mrs. Wilson, creating a semblance that there is two distinct aspects that is going on in this fight. Daisy, 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 shouted Miss Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy. Making a short, deft movement, Tom broke her nose with his open hand. This is a man that is unwilling to be crossed. He is willing to commit violence even against women to get what he wants. These are things that our character, Nick, is paying attention to and hearing things, and we're seeing these through his eyes. Chapter 3. Here we see a difference between how Tom was and how Daisy was, and how their fake intelligence and their fake superiority is being shown up by character of Gatsby. The two girls and Jordan leaned together confidently. Somebody told me that he killed a man once. A thrill passed over all of us. The three Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. I don't think it's so much as that, argued Lucille skeptically. It's more of that he was a German spy during the war. One of the men nodded confirmation. This is how we're introduced of the character of Gatsby, is the fact that he is a character that is talked about. Other people are talking about him. Instead of him creating an image around himself, other people are talking about him. But by contrast, as we entered, he wheeled decidedly around, examined Jordan from head to foot. What do you think? He demanded impetuously. About what? He waved his hand over the bookshelves. About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real. The books. He nodded. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages, and here, let me show you. Here, another character's giving an indication that Gatsby is more than just a facade, more than just what he's going on. By saying that these books are real, we got to remember that books are expensive, particularly in 1922, when this is set. It's extremely expensive to have a ton of books. Typically, if you have a party where you're showing off stuff, you don't care about certain things because who's going to check to see if the books are real? But here, this character who you only see one other time, who actually is, he's the only one that shows up to Gatsby's funeral later on besides Nick and a couple other people. But here we see a character that is set up to be somebody then more than just a facade. He is somebody that we are attached to because he isn't trying to show other people he is more than he is. But we learn later on that he isn't more than he is. He's actually just somebody that made money bootlegging or selling alcohol. But he's very upfront about the fact that he doesn't have the requisites that other people put on him. For instance, a number of people call him an Oxford man. Now he counters that later and says, well, I was only there for 4 months. I really can't consider myself an Oxford man. These are self-deprecating reports that he is giving to himself, saying, hey, I'm not saying what other people are saying I'm saying. It's what people are putting on me. These are things that endear Nick to Gatsby. This is later on after there's a huge confrontation between Daisy, Gatsby's love interest, and Tom. She doesn't understand. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. He broke off and began to walk up and down the desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. Here we are seeing that he is walking in his own desolation. The world he's creating to entice her over isn't giving him what he wants. I wouldn't ask too much for her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Here, Nick is telling Gatsby, hey, things are the way that they are. You can't just undo the things that they are just because you want them. You can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly as if the past were looking there in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. Here's a character that is looking to live that life that he wanted to have. He wants to redo the past. He wants to recreate the possibility of that love. He wants to hold on to it. And basically what he's doing is he's creating a false idea of what that past was. He's not taking into account how people grow, how people change. That's not to say that Daisy should be let off the hook for the things that she did. But he is holding on to something and it kills him later. By working of Tom and an accident, Gatsby ends up dying. Spoiler alert for this, 102 old story. But my point is that we have to, when we're telling our stories, we can add these elements into our own stories so that we can create these ideas and flesh out these characters. Our readers can understand that what's going on, and instead of just putting words on the page, we want to make sure that we are allowing our readers to feel these characters. When they're talking about Tom having a cruel body, there is a element of just beyond the words of the pages, but rather a almost being there. When it's talking about how hot the city is, it's actually giving you a very good visceral reaction of how sweaty and how horrible and how bad it is in that time before there was air conditioning. So let's go into some of those things and try to figure out how we can do these things in our own stories. All right, so basically what we can do here is actually plan out a little bit of how we want our interactions to go. Basically what we can do here is we can have our main character, we can have our protagonist, we can have our antagonist, and we can have multiple side characters, and we can actually create a semblance of how we want them to interact. We want them to show the connections and how they are trying to portray themselves. For instance, if we want our main character to be, and what I mean by main character here is as our primary person that we are viewing our story through. That does not mean that the MC, the main character, and the protagonist and the hero are all the same people. That's not actually always going to be the case, depending on how you write your story. For instance, our protagonist in this story is more of Gatsby. He doesn't show up until chapter 3, but our antagonist shows up a lot earlier. In this story, our main character is Nick. So let's put up some of the ideas of that, what they're trying to do. So for instance, that for Nick, one of his primary goals is that he wants to live his life and meet interesting people. We actually don't know too much about Nick, as he is somebody that we are viewing life through. We're viewing his experiences through. But for Gatsby, we learn a lot more about his past. We learn a lot more about how he came to be the person that he became. We see this dripped in over different periods and different interactions. We have different people that are popping up in the story that we are revealed to know a little bit more about Gatsby that gets revealed to Nick. So for Gatsby, he's trying to reclaim his past. He does this by doing things like buying the house across from Daisy's place. He does this by trying to make himself seem then he's not the bum that he was before. Not that he was necessarily a bum, but rather somebody that could earn or pay for Daisy's affection. For Tom, he is searching to hold on to his pride. Later on in the story, he talks about how women are about and too loose these days. This is a stark contradiction to the fact that he's sleeping with Mrs. Wilson, somebody else's wife. He doesn't recognize the irony of his statement because his pride is the only thing he cares about. His own pride is his own self-interest. He is looking to conquer. He is looking to overcome, and he doesn't care about anybody else. We saw that he has willingness to commit violence against people for the sake of his pride. Our first side character is Daisy. We don't really learn a lot about her. She does emulate Tom in a lot of different ways, but for her, it's a love versus safety debate. This is a well-reasoned perspective when it comes to how our characters, particularly our love interests, are going to be playing with the world. So for us, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to how they are being expressed. So for Daisy, it's a wishy-washy perspective. First she's with Gatsby, then she's with Tom, and it goes back and forth. Somebody who's not firm on what they want to do. We are creating a division in her mind of two visions, if you would. So the idea is that she has multiple things that she's trying to do. She's trying to be like Tom. She's trying to love Tom. She's trying to do these things. But at the same time, she has outside goals, outside desires that she is unwilling to give up the safety of Tom for. Tom is a very wealthy individual. So if she leaves him, she's at risk of losing everything that she has. And this is not to say that she doesn't love Tom. This is very clearly put in later that she has a schism between Tom and Gatsby, but she cannot say that she didn't love Tom. She loved Gatsby, but she couldn't say that she didn't love Tom. For Mrs. Wilson, she is trying to escape a bad marriage. She expected to marry somebody who was a savant, who she thought was a very intelligent person, and she didn't listen to anybody else when they told her that he wasn't, that Mr. Wilson wasn't a very smart person. But soon after, she realized she made a mistake. So she's trying to find a way out of the bad situation, which is a bad marriage. So these are all ways that we can add into our stories about how we are creating interactions between our characters. Those interactions between our characters can be the lifeblood of our stories. So when we think about how we tell our stories, make sure you're putting emphasis on how they're connecting and how people are trying to show themselves to other people. This isn't something for the first draft. This is a second, third, fourth, or however many drafts later. These are elements that we can add to add flavoring, sort of like an icing flour on top of a cake. These are things that are not fundamental to our story, but are elements that give more depth and meaning to it. All right? That's all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. As always, I will be linking the book in the description below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.